It's okay with everybody. We'll go ahead and call the meeting to order here at 8:01 a.m. Just turned 8:02, so I'll say 8:02. We are here. I know there was information last night that came out of the select board meeting to name for the group. If we have time to get into any of that, we can, but the goal of today's meeting was FY25, since we've been a little bit delayed on that due to some internal IT stuff. And so I think we should jump into that. Peter, you got it up here.
Yeah.
I'll share my screen on the Zoom for anybody who's joining on that. Okay, you're good to go.
Okay, so these are the same slides, just a recap of kind of context. We just left these slides in past updates to this point here in terms of the work that we've done to address the deficit. Just to give everyone some context, we have been meeting continually with all of our leadership team to look at any and all budget lines to see where we can pull back funds. We have it has got increasingly challenging this year with our hiring freeze and staffing needs. You may have heard of that in the community. Principals have been working to utilize staff in different ways. I think paper was a big topic recently as well. So we're essentially any and all area that we can cut back on, we are. Here's an outline of kind of work both in progress rather, and completed. The most recent work we've been doing has been on substitute coverage, and we're finalizing an agreement with the MEA right now to move from individual classroom to kind of like auditorium or cafeteria, kind of like a study hall, as opposed to having individual substitutes in each classroom. In terms of what's left, and you know, Katie and I have talked about this a lot, and as I said, I've talked with both central office leaders and with our principals. Further cuts, things that we are not contracted to do, like for example, spring sports. We don't feel like, in terms of the savings, that to cancel spring sports would be such a significant impact on our students that we don't feel like that's a viable option. That is one of the areas, kind of quote unquote, left in the budget that we would be able to, but in terms of like the total, we also have user fees connected to that. So the gain from that, Katie, do you remember what you had figured out in terms of after user fees? So like 200,000 or so.
150,000.
Yeah. We don't feel like that is something that we should do, just as I said, based on the importance of those activities for our students. In terms of where we are, and we have made a lot of progress. We are down to right now with the circuit breaker funding, which again is potential, but we believe that will be coming, an additional 488,000. We do have the potential of the Chromebook capital funding that we have shared previously. I have been in conversation with Nick about that. I'm going to be recommending that the school committee vote on that in our next meeting. That brings it down to 383, and then Katie has spent time digging through and working on finding more offset to utilize, which brings us down to 283. Katie, anything you want to add in terms of kind of I know we've been talking about special education and we do think, and I did see the email from Amanda this morning. We do think it would be helpful to have Danielle come in on next Monday to talk about special ed and kind of cost, because that is an area that continues to move the needle on closing this gap. And Katie, do you want to learn more about that?
No, I think, as we've continued to run the reports, just trying to update what the projection is for the end of the year. We can see that by implementing some of the changes with purchase order freeze, hiring freeze, that has helped us, in some ways, but while that work is taking place, we're continuing to see costs that were unexpected for special ed. And so I think it's difficult because some of the cost containment measures that we're trying to implement across the board, in some instances haven't been to offset some of the increases that we're seeing kind of in the special education world. And so it just makes it complicated, and it's just further complicated by the fact that in a typical year, we would have, there's kind of that outside funding made available to us for special education costs through grants and the circuit breaker program. And so in a year where you have reserves, you can utilize that funding. That's what it's meant for, right? And for this year, we just don't have that option. So that's really putting a lot of pressure on the operating budget.
Questions? I have a couple. The 488 for circuit breaker, how that we now have a number, so I assume that you've gotten kind of updated information on that, but can you share just more on like how confident we are in I know the
Sure.
timeline was a place of concern for you
Yeah.
before.
It definitely is. So I think there's a legislative update that's happening in the South Shore this morning. So I'm hoping to hear some more information from that. So what that supplemental funding is for circuit breaker, the Department of Education provides the state with an approximate number of what they think the overall expenditure is going to be for transportation for the year. And then that gives the state a number to say, okay, this is what the potential funding should be through the circuit breaker reimbursement program. When those numbers were submitted the past year, they didn't account for this tremendous increase in costs that we saw across the state. And so the number, ultimately, the circuit breaker program for transportation should be the goal is to reimburse costs at 75% above the threshold. And right now for transportation, we're only being reimbursed 44%. And so the supplemental funding for this year is meant to address the fact that there was a significant increase in costs that wasn't initially projected, and saying that we have $150 million at the state level to be able to address that increase. And with the hopes of updating the reimbursement from 44% to 75%. So that 488 number is our 31% of reimbursement. That's what it would reflect. And so it's significant. It's a significant number. I still have not heard clarity or have received confirmation that it's going to pass. So that's still a concern, and the timing of it. But that, if it does pass, and if it is made available to us for this year, if we receive the entire 31%, that's what the number would be.
And in terms of, have you done the analysis? I know it says here that we will need to raise
Mhm.
tuition significantly for next year.
Mhm.
What is that?
Mhm.
mean? What's the impact
Yeah.
of families?
So, for community schools, for the summer program, we just recently at the last meeting, updated the rates. We did a 10% increase for the summer programs. So and I think I had included this information, but in past years, those programs had run at a slight deficit, which was made up by the revenue that we received throughout the rest of the year. And so when Martha Sandoval, the director, and I sat down and looked at the actual projections of expenses for the entire year, we did see that we would need to increase tuition by 10% to make sure that we're still operating as a self-sustaining program for next year. And we would have to continue to increase at those increments for future years if our expenses were projected to remain the same. And that is also contingent on us using the $200,000 on an annual basis to say cover our overhead as we have been. And that was built into the budget for fiscal year 26. Community schools, we call it an offset, but that charge back to community schools. And so knowing that we've increased costs with the rates that we're paying our employees and by increasing capacity in the program, I think it would be I would say almost the least amount would be 10%. So looking from a 10 to a 15% increase.
And we are, in our previous analyses, we are low in terms
Low.
of our current tuition rate, so.
Right.
We no longer have the problem of that large balance.
That's right.
Can I ask about Chromebook capital funding? So you said you've talked to Nick about this. And his statement that is something he would support within the capital planning committee, and help advocate for on behalf of the schools to.
Yep.
That was a place that, just to be clear, that's a place like we don't fully control, obviously, as a school committee. We
Yes.
need support from capital, and then it would require an allocation or a vote by town meeting, right?
Yeah, so the vote would be to rescind our request for the Chromebooks and the rooftop units and utilize that and either ask the select board, or I think the school committee could also put forward an article for town meeting to utilize that free cash in FY25. So that's what the vote would be next week.
Sorry, Anna wasn't paying attention. Anna?
Thank you. Do you mind going back to slide 5 for a second? Sorry.
Yeah.
I did have a question about the substitute coverage. And Peter, I came in a few minutes late, but you had mentioned working with the MEA in terms of what that would look like for students. You said maybe perhaps like cafeteria model or like being in the auditorium. Like, what does that look like? Is it like a large group of students in an auditorium with, someone to kind of just keep an eye on them? Is there like learning happening during that time? How does that work?
So it's a model that's already been used previously. I think in both schools during COVID.
Yeah, and it wasn't successful. That's why I was asking.
Yeah, it has continued to be used at the high school. And yeah, I mean, the plan would be for one teacher would oversee a maximum of 50 students. So
Okay.
it's not like one teacher to 200 kids.
Okay.
And they would be, working on their Chromebooks, they would be doing class related work. It's not ideal. But it is one of the things that we recognize that we could do.
Right, in this particular moment.
Yeah, yeah.
I think, sorry, and if you had more.
No, I understand that it's not ideal. I just am concerned that that's where we would try to look for cost savings if we implemented that model during COVID and it wasn't successful. So I'm just curious why we're even looking at that as an option
Just to,
elsewhere.
yeah, just to jump on that, I think last time when we talked about that, my question was, what do we anticipate those cost savings being by doing this? Because that's obviously, 2 teachers for 20, 1 teacher for 25 is, I assume, kind of a class size, so 1 per 50 is kind of cutting that in half in situations.
Right.
So like, what do we imagine that saving us between now, implementing it now with EMEA, I assume, between now and the end of the year? What's that get us?
So still trying to work out the kind of like fine tune the details of it, but because it would be, it essentially would mean that a teacher could cover 2 classes instead of covering 1.
Yeah.
And so, right now, I believe at the middle school, just kind of that extra, we call it extra duty because it's essentially the teacher is giving up their prep period, which I think is also, something that is time that they should be able to use for to prepare, right? And so they would be giving up that time, and now instead of going into another classroom, they would be covering 2 classes. So if we're saying it was previously the cost was $1,200 a day, we're looking at a reduction to potentially, I don't think it would be half, but I think it would be potentially $300 a day, depending on, depending on when we can implement it too. And so I think when we had originally talked about this, we had talked about it in a way of like, is there enough time? Is there something that we can do kind of over the course of the time that is going to help us just almost in the cost containment rather than eliminating a cost? And so I'm not sure that it is going to have a significant impact with the deficit, but it's just one measure.
And that would only be something at the high school and the middle school?
Correct, yeah,
Okay, and so if we're talking, is that $300 a day per site or kind of
per
total?
site. Mhm.
Okay, so by my rough math, if we're at the 2/3 the way through the year, we have about 60 days of school left. $300 a day times 60 is 18,000 times 2 is 36,000. So we're talking about $35,000 that you're estimating this plan would save. Anna?
I'm just curious, like, yeah, I see that the cost savings is not that significant and obviously would be a big impact on time on learning for students. And, as a parent of middle schoolers, having 50 kids in an auditorium with 1 teacher is not ideal. I mean, I can barely manage my 2. So I'm going to be honest. It doesn't seem like a realistic solution that is going to make sure that the students are getting the time on learning that they need, especially, I mean, when you're talking about middle school and high school, these students went through COVID. They're already, areas where they're behind, and not getting that support during that time is not really cost savings. I don't know if we've looked at other areas where, we have programs that, are have stipends that, that we can look at reducing instead, that won't have such a significant impact. So when you're talking about 50 kids each day, like that's a lot of kids that it's impacting. I'm just wondering if we've explored other areas that where the impact wouldn't be as significant.
So I'll follow up to that. we're talking about one class period potentially,
Mhm.
not the full day.
Yeah.
Correct.
Stuck in an
Yeah,
auditorium,
yeah.
so it is not.
Yep.
I do understand there is obviously an impact on students, but we're not talking about, extended amount of time just sitting there.
Mhm.
So I do get it, but I do feel like this pressure of reducing that gap as much as we can. We already said, sports is not on the table, but yet sports would give us more of a savings. Not that I'm advocating for that, let me just be clear. But we have to find it somewhere. I do feel that if we don't, we're gonna, there was talk yesterday of like revisiting a vote. Like, I would hate for that to be the case. So I guess I'm just gonna push on that I think the impact on students is not
Yeah,
as great because of the time period that they would spend
yeah.
in a large group.
We also when we talked about the sub coverage, we talked about, we still do have building subs that we'll be able to utilize in the classroom. We talked about when looking at the substitute coverage, is there a way to utilize that model for maybe not for your math and your ELA and your core content blocks, but is there a way to utilize that model for specialists or, just trying to look at it like, it doesn't necessarily need to be an all or nothing model, that we can use it as just another tool to say, okay, we're just revisiting this. Is there a way that we can do this a little bit differently? When we worked with the union, we did talk to them about this and saying, really, we're utilizing this kind of as a measure to try to contain our costs through the end of the year, realizing that this is just temporary. This is just a temporary agreement, temporary, adjustment to kind of our operating model and trying to look at it in that way because, I think we all truly recognize and would like to lessen the impact to our students. Also realizing that in any situation where you're trying to cut $1 million from the operating budget, it's going to be felt somewhere. It just it's just the scale of what those cuts and the impact and who's failing it and how they're failing it. So there was definitely a lot of conversation. It wasn't just like a blanket, like, okay, everyone in every class period is going to either the auditorium or the cafeteria. So people are definitely trying to be mindful of that, and being mindful of that because we know that we want to lessen the impact to student learning.
Yeah, I would just make sure that when we're looking at this, it's that we're exploring other possible areas to cut versus anything that directly impacts. And I understand that it might only be 45 minutes or 50 minutes a day, but that's a lot,
Mhm.
especially like, as I mentioned, for kids that have already been behind with COVID and all of these other things and being in large class sizes, we've talked about all of that. So I am not completely on board with that. This is the solution that we can find. If there are other areas that we can cut that aren't directly impacting students, those are the ones that we should be exploring first, because again, we talked about looking at this from a, least impact to students. And this to me, in a 6-hour, class, school day, that's a big chunk of time. And, I'm not completely sold on it. So just wanted to put that out there.
So I appreciate that, Anna, and just to build on that, because what we're talking about is $30,000 where we still have 283 outstanding. And you mentioned sports, but I think Selena alluded to sort of our context following last night. And I totally understand the situation now, which is literally in order for the select board to move forward with plan, they need to understand whether the schools are gonna be coming back and asking for help from the town to cover this gap. So I kind of feel like there's an elephant in a room here, because you're mentioning sports, but I'm not hearing like, what are the other options, whether it's in place of the sub coverage plan, or we just have to do the sub coverage plan, like what else are we doing? And I recognize it's not, we would need more time. It's a moving target. We're still working on it and things are still fluid. I get that, but at the same time, like we have to be able to identify like where we're at, what we're doing. So what more can you tell us to help us understand that? Like, because I think it's not what, after last night, it's clear for me that like we are unable to wait and until closer to the end of the year to indicate like where we've ended up. We have to be able to do that now. And the ball is in our court, like for the next 2 days.
2 days, yes. 2 days.
So,
And I don't sort of want to see us take these drastic measures, but if sports are on the table, sports are on the table, but what else I think I would say are on the table?
like,
Yeah. Of like, that would get us to narrow this gap further. And I know we don't want to have that conversation because we don't want that impact directly on students, but I think we're at that point, right? And all of this is impacting students in one way or another. But we are at that critical juncture where I heard it loud and clear last night that willingness to reconvene on Friday and reconsider the vote. That, while it still requires, last night's vote would still require some cuts on our end as we look forward, but it's less drastic. So I just would reiterate your question. How do we get there?
I mean,
or if we don't get there,
Yeah.
we have to be honest about that.
Yeah.
Right now.
Like say our gap is 283 because we're not
And then that
considering
will,
anything else.
and that will make, that will be an impact we have to then deal with in the future, because we will have less benefit from the override.
Yeah.
So I feel like we just need to put it out there right now. And I'm not on finance, so I'm sorry if I'm just being overly like,
No, I agree with you.
what with it, but I'm feeling a lot of time pressure here. So Peter, like, what if, or if there's not able to be a plan, like,
I
what's our
mean,
response?
we've looked at our entire budget. We've been looking at our entire budget. So in terms of closing 283 right now, today or tomorrow, as Katie and I have looked at this, as we've talked with principals, what we can see in the budget, and again, like, we might close the 283 and then we continue having special ed costs coming in that are, I mean, that has been happening as we've been closing this deficit. So like, what's on the table? Like, how do we get to zero? We want to get to zero. What's on the table are sports. The other thing that's probably on the table would be any of our kind of non-contracted positions that are helping the district operate essentially. So our HRS positions, which are kind of our at-will positions, is kind of the other area that will then, things, the district will stop operating because those positions are essentially what keeps the wheels turning here. So, I mean, in terms of what else is on the table, and Katie, please jump in here if you, I mean, I know we've already talked about this, so there's nothing that we haven't discussed, but this is kind of based on what we can do in the operating year. This is where we are.
So we would be comfortable with saying that this is our best effort to get to a balanced budget, but we do foresee about a $300,000 gap. Remain.
I mean, the only
I mean, I
other
think
thing
it's
is,
something that
we
could-
did look at offsets and, you know, Katie looked at that again yesterday to just kind of like do one more pass to see like,
Mhm.
and I don't know, Katie, if you
Mhm.
want to speak
Yeah.
to that.
If I can just back up to, not to directly address any of the questions being asked, but just to let you know, I did do a kind of like mid-cycle report, financial report. It's not a report, it's simply the budget in detail. And so I updated that and I put a copy of that in the folder for today's meeting. When I updated it, the previous quarterly reports were provided at a cost center roll-up summary. And so, given kind of the financial status that we're currently in, I updated that so that the report that is in the folder is the line level detail. So you can see for this fiscal year, you can see what the budget is. You can see what we've spent already, what we're projecting to spend, and what the year-end balance is. And then it also has the information for the funding that we're requesting for next year. So just to let you know that that work is happening, because that is also a big piece of this, right? Is the fact that this is a projection and it's based off of, in some instances, estimates of what we think is going to happen from March 1st until June 30th, which is 3 months of a school operating year. So that is just that piece that I wanted you all to know, that that work has happened. I'll continue to update those reports. So I think the next reporting period that makes sense would be at the end of March, which would be the quarterly report typically. And so that will be the next update. I think when we talk about some of the modifications for this year, and even when we look at some of the ways that we're gonna try to close the gap for this year, for me, it is very much thinking about what is the impact going to be for next year. And so I'm also looking at, as I had done previously, the areas that we're overspent or we're projecting that we're going to overspend for this year, looking to see what is the impact for next year and have we adjusted appropriately. And in some instances we have, and I felt comfortable with that. And then in some instances, there is a projected gap, and that's specific to special ed transportation. So I just want to name that as that is the information as it currently stands and as it's currently projected. And you can see that in the reports that have been provided to you. In looking at cutting the deficit for this year, I think everything that we do is going, I don't disagree with anything that's been said. Anything that we do this year is going to have an impact for next year, whether it's in how we're cutting the gap, if we're going to the town for funding, what funding looks like for next year, and then it's also in what process are we using to cut the gap, because that impact is going to be an impact to our students that is going to carry forward, right? To Anna's point, we have middle school students that are coming off of COVID that could be significantly impacted by some additional learning loss. And so I think that these are the hard issues that we're all trying to like kind of balance in moving forward. As far as other areas, I have looked at the offsets, and I just think by taking any additional offsets, which we could potentially take more from community schools, we could potentially take from areas But then if we take any more from community schools, we're looking at a tuition increase of 20% next year.
Right.
And so I think it's just being mindful of
Yeah.
that is what the impact is. And the same with, we reviewed our transportation fees. We haven't reviewed athletics for next year. And maybe we're looking at a significant increase in athletic fees because we're just needing to offset the budget that much more for next year. So, those are just some other things to consider.
Anna's got her hand up. I want to get to her. I just
Yeah.
one clarifying question. The savings from coverage that y'all list in slide 5, is that dollar amount impacting this 283 gap? Y'all have that? Is
No,
that
so that savings.
Yeah.
Is not included in the 280 because we haven't finalized that coverage,
okay?
so that
That
would,
was my understanding.
yeah,
just
so
wanna
I
make sure.
can include that too, and that would bring it
That
up
was
250.
250.
Just wanna make
Yes,
sure. Anna?
yep,
Sorry. So I know last week at our meeting, we had the positions that were hired since 2019. Have we looked at any of those? Anything that we've put in there? And I mean, I know it's not ideal, but just looking at, are there things that we could possibly do without until this override passes and revisit next year? Because again, I think having a balance going into an override is not ideal, but at the same time, what can we do without? It's just really concerning. I get, that we're looking at sports on the table and all of these other things. And those are things, that we might have to cut to close that gap. But again, what are there other areas? And, I'm gonna throw it out there. I know, we initially had like the stipends for the equity coaches at each of our schools. Are there other positions? I'm on the DEIB committee at Pierce, so it's something of value and importance to me. But is that an area that we can potentially, it's definitely a nice to have, and it provides a lot of support for our students. I'm just thinking out loud. I know we're in a tough spot, but really just looking at what are those positions where we're keeping as much time on learning as we can. It's just, I'm just throwing out there, like, we could always, bring it back as, when we have the funds. It's just, I'm just looking at least amount of in terms of learning loss and impact on students from that angle. Because again, when you're asking for an override, it's really important that we're not, it's not at the cost of the impact to students from a learning standpoint.
We have looked at all of our stipends, and most of those exist at the middle school and high school. Most of them are paid out over the entire year. And so they're paid, I believe, in 2 installments.
yeah.
So those stipends have been paid out. And there's a potential of some kind of proration, but it's not very significant.
Do we have a sense of what the proration impact would be?
What's the number?
Like what's the total?
Well, for the equity leads, do you remember what that's?
It's 2,000 a year. They've already been paid 1,000, and that was up until work that they've completed in December. The second payment is in May, and so it would essentially be 2 months out of if we're saying they're completing their work over a 10-month period, it would be 2 months of that 10-month period that we could prorate. So we'd pay them $800 of the remaining stipend. I believe I want to say we have 8 equity leads or 9 equity leads. So if it was $200 a person, it would be $1,800 would be the savings.
Yeah, I even think I'm not just the equity lead position, but to that
Yeah.
point, I mean, I will say I think as we talked about previously, like the idea of getting to zero was going to hurt. And so I was expecting any conversation here to hurt. I'm slightly frustrated that we don't have like a slide here that says $150,000 for spring sports, right? For cutting these HRS positions, like just what are all the options that get us to zero? Because I think that's what the school committee needs to discuss before we are gonna feel before I'm at least can speak for myself, gonna feel comfortable going back to select board to say 250 is the best we can do, because I don't feel comfortable letting go of this position, this program, et cetera, et cetera. And so
I think we just, I mean, that's the thing. It's like, I would like to see what are the areas, I know initially, like we had a budget analyst position that was, like with some of the work that Katie does, and, they tend to, could overlap. And we talked about that in a previous meeting as well. Like, are there positions that we can do without temporarily? It's just, I'm just reaching, but I really think closing that gap is going to be so important to help us with, passing that override. So really just looking at what's the least impact to students. I mean, I would say not a fan of cutting athletics, because again, that's part of what makes a whole student, right? Like you need that like outlet as well, and cutting theater and drama. Like I was at chorus at the high school last night and it was phenomenal. So like cutting those things that make kids who they are and express themselves are not necessarily things that I would look at, but like, are there positions that, I know it's really hard. Again, we're talking about people, but least impact to students. It's just, I would really like to see those explored, because, going back to the select board to ask for money to close that gap and figure it out for next year is just doesn't put us in the best light to pass an override.
yeah, and I also would love to not cut art or sports or any of the other things, but I think laying on the table, this is like, again, 81% of our budget is salaries. Almost all of those are contracted. We get no savings by cutting them, right? We've already paid out certain stipends through 8 months. Like that's not an option. We already are going to pay utilities. We have special ed costs, transportation costs are contracted, nutrition costs are contracted, like all these things. That's like 98% of our budget, maybe 99.5% of our budget, whatever it is, we can't touch. And so we understand that having the full list of here are the things we can touch, because at least talk about it and discuss it publicly and share, like, community, if we were going to actually close this gap, this is what it would mean.
It would mean no sports for the kids.
It would be no choir, right? No
Right,
spring
exactly.
choir performance. I don't, whatever that is, and just be clear. And
Like
that's,
furloughing people, the HRS, is that a thing that can happen, like the non-contracted positions? I mean.
it's going to be hard, whatever it is, it's going to be hard, but I feel like we're not leaning into the hard, and that's just the position we are in. That's position we put ourselves in within this year, is that we got to lean into the hard. I think it's too easy to just say, let's go back to select board. Like there's not enough money. They're pinching. They talked last night about the difference between 9.5 and 9.925 being $4 a month. And that was something they really like didn't even consider discussing, going up to $4. So the select board has made it pretty clear they are very firm on this 9.5 number. They just voted last night to cut our budget allocation by $700,000, right? So we're already experiencing that. To cut that further because we can't close this gap, or at least they don't feel like we've done enough to close the gap and be clear about the ways in which we are critically thinking about our budget. That is I think, an outcome of this that I think is reasonable given what they were saying last night and coming out of this conversation. And so I'm worried that we're not getting clarity that we need to have this public conversation and talk about the public pain of getting to zero. And then all of that is kind of with the also understanding y'all are saying y'all are still getting unexpected special ed expenses, that the 250. And so I don't know then how we go honestly back to select board and say 250 is the number. If y'all aren't saying you feel confident 250 is the number, so then what is the number? And how can they exit, because they're right now using the full $3 million free cash that we would need to tap into in their scenario in which they're kind of getting us to 4 years. And so I don't know what to tell them when we need a number, we need a number from
We need a
them
hard
a month
number.
ago. And we're not helping that situation. So none of those were solution oriented statements, and I apologize, but I think for me, to a bit of Anna's point, and some other points made here of just like, I need a master list of just, these are all the things that we could choose to do. Right, spring sports fees, we do an emergency implementation of increasing them by, I don't know, 10%. What would that get us? Like, what are just any of the options that get us a little bit? If we're talking about stipend changes that would get us $1,800, or again, coverage changes that get us $15,000. Like, all of these are little pieces.
It's like the question is, what are the drastic measures we could have this beyond this? And I want to commend you for all the work you've done. I think it's wonderful. I mean, compared to where we were, our projected gap and this, it's progress. But I think we do have that pressure of what else, and we need to answer that. And I don't know if we could do it here right now, because I feel like
We have to
without-
right now.
we
I
have
feel
to.
like we need to work.
We have to
section
sort of
right
work
now,
through
like,
numbers.
honestly.
Because we can't,
don't
we
understand.
gotta, yeah, they're just waiting for us. So I think if we start sort of listing what else we can do. And I'm gonna say that's for sports and anything else that we might be, it doesn't mean that we'll end there, but let's put it there. And what else we can put on that list. Let's work it through, it right now.
We can come up with a list of all of our HRS positions. More specifics around sports costs. And anything else that. Drastic or direct impact to students, though it may be. I'm not sure what that will look like in terms of sped services. So we'll need to work with Danielle on that.
I think what we're saying is that we don't have time to break and keep working, so we need to try to do something right now. Right, like that's where we are.
I mean, the alternative is we are jeopardizing the select board's ability to identify the number for the override. And I'm not comfortable with that. Because we all know we need the clarity on that to be able to message it to the community. So to me, it's just about the candor of the moment. I agree. I wish we would have been able to look at, like, we're weighing drastic and terrible choices as far as how we're going to save the money. Like, that would have been something important for this school committee to have the opportunity to do, and we've not had that opportunity. But in the meantime, like, I think we also need to be considering, if we're not getting to zero, and if that's just not realistic, we just need to be able to be honest that that's where we are right now. And then we need to look at what are the implications? If that means we are gonna have to take a further reduction, and we're gonna have to look at hard choices in the coming years, like, we have to do that, I guess. But I don't think it works to conclude this meeting now with the next step is you're gonna look at it and come back. Because then when are we gonna be able to do that? The select board is reconvening on Friday. It's mid-March.
I was thinking Wednesday, but.
I don't think we have until Wednesday, honestly. I mean, if we wait until next Wednesday, we're talking about, we're gonna be like a month away from the override when the select board can set the number. That to me is not acceptable.
Anna?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, we're in a position where we have to make some drastic measures. And again, having a list of those, as Mark mentioned, and kind of just looking at from a student standpoint, what the least impact to students would be the decision that I would say we should make. And then try as much as we can to get that number to zero, because again, if we go in with the number that we all voted on last week, which is the 9.5, and carry that, the 6.45, that for us, the new level service, and then having a gap and then asking for an override and then not being able to meet that for next year. I'm still like, with these deficits and what Katie mentioned earlier and Peter mentioned about the special ed costs continuing, as much as we're trying to put things in place to close that gap, it doesn't really help because we're still bleeding out one end. So that's going to continue to be there. It just does concern me getting into next year, because we can't, as much as we try, we can't really promise that we won't have a deficit. So that is very concerning. So again, we have to, unfortunately, we're in a position because of these things, that we'll have to take some drastic measures. But again, looking at it in a way that it's, again, least impacts student well-being, and teaching and learning, obviously. So if we could get, I don't know if there's, so we have to decide by Friday. Is that what I heard?
No, Anna, it's the select board took a vote last night
Yes.
on the 9.5.
Right.
The select board will be reconvening on Friday to perhaps reconsider that vote if they are not satisfied with how far we get in closing the gap.
So when they say reconsider, are they saying like increase the number or decrease the number? Like, what are they?
It'll just have the impact on our rate at the 700. Is that correct? It'll go up.
It's not 100% clear what they would recommend is the impact. It's just a matter of, if we need $250,000 of free cash, then the $3 million of free cash that they are utilizing to carry us through is now 275,000 and or 2.75. And so anyways, it just changes the math a bit of how we get to FY30, which seemed to be their goal.
It's a question of whether or not we are going to need to tap into free cash that is built into the model of what they have tentatively approved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if we need to request that, tap into that, it will just change
Mhm.
what they're able to set aside within the override. So it's
Going forward.
to me, it is a very actually logical,
Yep.
cut and dried deadline for us to answer to.
Mhm.
There's not it's just literally how much our free cash will be available to allocate towards this within the override. So
Mhm.
this is completely valid for us to need to provide this clarity on this deadline.
And so just for my clarification, we're saying, so right now the free cash number is 3 million. And then based off of, if any of that free cash needs to be used for fiscal year 25, changes the planning for fiscal year 26. But in fiscal year 26, is there the assumption that a portion of that free cash is going to be used for special ed stabilization
$1
fund?
million
It's $1 million.
So it might,
under the plan B that they
Decrease.
voted on. Yes.
Okay,
so potentially,
it could
if we needed
decrease.
to tap into free cash now,
Okay,
potentially it would impact that and allow the select board to set aside less
So
for
like
that within the
750 instead
override.
of $1 million or something.
okay.
That's where I think we just need to be
Mhm,
forthright with,
mhm, mhm,
so that it
Mhm.
could be hopefully adjusted
mhm,
if necessary.
mhm.
And if I can for 1 second to add to the urgency of the immediacy, I'll be asked as they head out of here, how did this go?
Right.
I mean, no, I mean, I'm not saying the decision will be made on it, but I'll be asked.
Yeah. That's exactly, that's the point. That's why we can't just wrap this up to say, well, we're gonna get back to
We don't have the
it,
time.
like.
Yeah.
I feel like that's why next Wednesday is just not gonna work.
So to the point of that, working it through, I added slide 7 if you want to go to that, just to say like, are there categories? I mean, again, I know it's gonna be hard for y'all to just say, here are the numbers, because there's work to do to pull the numbers. But I think at least a starting place would be clarity on just like, what are the places of flexibility we have between now and the end of the year to cut? So I just started creating lists based on kind of what we've talked about, and then I added in one. But are there other things on this list that again are like not locked in between now and the end of the year?
One of the assumptions built into the fiscal year 25 kind of projections was the utility utilization. And so I don't know if there's a way for us to kind of limit the timing around when, I mean, do we say that we are not opening the buildings 7 days a week? And potentially reduce. Because our buildings are open 7 days a week, and so we're paying for heat and light and all of those things 7 days a week. And so do we look at a way to shut the buildings down on weekends? I mean, I think we have, the community uses our buildings for basketball and a number of different things, but that's just,
Well, there's some fees
Right.
associated with that too.
and there's definitely fees associated with it, and the fees, a utilization of some of those fees was built in to this as an offset.
Right.
But it's just the utility expenses are pretty significant with how we're heating and lighting our buildings, so. I just didn't know if there were 2 days out of the week that we were almost limiting. If that would help.
It's again, something to consider. I don't know how we would, from like a number perspective, how you would estimate what the savings would be on that.
Right.
I'd have a tough time figuring out what that would be.
Mhm.
Because there's still some heat and some
Yes,
lighting, like
yeah.
it's not
Of course.
zero.
Yeah.
So you don't just divide it by 2.
I don't know enough about that control system either, if it's something where we can set weekends, I believe we can. But, that's something that I could try to connect with Tom McCarthy about. I can, I don't have it right now, but I was also thinking about kind of like the sports fees. I'm not sure where we are in the registration process. But I can try to get numbers, more concrete numbers around the number of students that we've had register and pay and what that would look like if we were saying there was going to be kind of an increase in fees.
Mhm.
Out of district transportation is another area too, that we've gone back to the vendors and tried to negotiate the rates. Just as a part of the bid process, and then also because we don't have to follow mass procurement law for special ed transportation providers, so we've been trying to negotiate lower rates with that. And so that is work that is currently in progress, but then we also have potential new needs of students requiring transportation. So some of the cost savings that we have with negotiating the new rates are potentially going to be offset by having to pay for additional kids.
But I do think we should look again at our community school offset and determine if the increase, looking at comparable districts and costs, if the increase in fees for next year kind of puts us in line with other districts because we're low now, and whatever that, I know we're talking 10%, but you know, as you were kind of talking about an additional 50,000 from there. Just
I guess-
understanding what the impact would be in a percentage.
Yeah, not to veer too far off. I guess I don't fully understand that piece of if we want the program to be, it should be
Self-sustaining.
self-sustaining.
Yeah,
Why would the use of additional community schools funds within the current year change the rate for next? Is it that we just think a 10% increase actually won't make it self-sustaining, even that large of an increase?
mhm,
And we would still have to use the kind of reserves
mhm,
for next year in order, and the goal there is to kind of soft increase. Okay.
mhm. Yeah, because
Right,
our
now I understand.
expenses are exceeding the revenue that we're bringing in.
So it's just
So-
to
Mhm.
limit the impact of
What is our
families in
current
this single year.
balance on schools?
I believe the balance is $1,045,000. In community schools. That's just as of yesterday. But that's just a snapshot, so that's not taking into account kind of expenses up until the end of the year and then the revenue that's coming in. We do have, we did look at some of the just projections of, if we continue the current operating model with the fees that we're charging in, we would be in a deficit position without raising the fees. So. It's just, I think with the community schools too, it's just not sustainable for the future.
Yeah.
So we can't just keep saying, or if we are saying that, we just need to make sure that the revenue reflects the funding that we need to be able to use some of that to offset the operating budget.
So any chance of putting estimates to these right now, or we can't?
So the HRS position cut savings. I just don't know how that would work with furloughing employees, so I think that was something that we would probably need to get more guidance, because some of those employees may have accrued vacation time.
Mhm.
And so I don't know if we would have to pay them out their vacation time
Right.
and then furlough them.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
So that's something that we'd have to get some guidance, potential
Around, right.
guidance on,
Mm-hmm.
and then just look at that. Stipend freezes. We would
And which
really,
positions, you know, as well.
field trip freezes, the field trips, are typically funded by PTO. And so I think that would just have minimal savings. The field trips that I'm thinking about, that would have an impact to the operating budget would just be more of like, field trips between schools. So if we have our students that go up to Pierce for like that transition program at the end of the year, I think that, having 2 buses, it would be under $1,000 for those types of trips.
I think the other thing to put on there is that community school offset and determining the kind of the maximum.
I don't know if there's a way to look at our preschool program, and I just say this just to, it's in the similar vein as athletics. knowing that we do not want to impact anything, but preschool doesn't have the same kind of mandate around the number of days that we operate. And so, and we do have a significant cost, so I don't know, if we look at, I think preschool starts a little later. Do we say maybe preschool ends a little sooner? Than our typical school year? That is just, I'm
Yeah,
an
yeah.
idea.
No, it's helpful.
It's good.
What the teachers and the aides though are,
The teachers and the aides
Contracted.
are contracted, but I was more thinking about kind of the transportation costs, because it's a per day, per student model. And so. But again, it's difficult when we look at preschool because it's also a revenue-based program. Where if we're charging our peers to attend the program and we charge them a certain rate. And then we're saying we're modifying the program, is there some implication to that? So.
Is there anything further with food service or? Other than the custodial?
And did the federal actions around food in schools have any impact to us?
Not to us directly, but I think it was close to $1 billion for other Massachusetts schools that participate in certain programs.
Okay.
And so I would just say not that time, but we don't know
Right.
what's gonna happen
Yeah.
truly. Um,
And so if we would take the drastic measure of the spring sports, I'm just gonna say that, that's the one we have a sense of a number more clearly, right? Would bring us to 130.
with the savings from coverage, that'd be like, 100.
100.
I think those two
Right.
things.
Potentially.
Potentially.
And then add to that, the community schools offset potentially.
Potentially.
I heard you say ballpark 50,000.
50.
That would result in a 20% fee increase next year.
Mhm.
So that's 50,000. And potentially through stipend freezes in HRS. Maybe that's
Mhm.
the path. So again, I think that this is the type of conversation that we need to be having, which is weighing
Mhm.
that drastic impact of that series of decisions over asking for some of the free cash that we would be receiving through the override to be like allocated sooner and mean we have a more challenging time in out years with the override, but and I appreciate Anna's point that, we've all been working towards getting to zero. That's what we've been talking about and needing and trying to do. We also recognize we're operating with a structural deficit that we have not been able to close in the past recent years without accessing one-time funds, which is why we have to consider these drastic measures we've not previously considered in order to get to zero. This is what it takes to get to zero. So I think it should stay on the table that we might ask for 50, 100, 150,000, 200, I don't know, like, but we would only be able to ask for that showing like we are weighing cutting all spring sports or asking for this amount of free cash.
Mhm.
Like, that's the choice, that's the position we're in.
Mhm.
And I just think our job right now is to just be completely transparent with that decision. And then none of us want to go ask for free cash. None of us want to do that. But if that's like what we need to do, we have to take a proactive step to do that.
Mhm.
Anna?
I'm gonna really caution you about cutting spring sports. I think you will lose support for an override if you do that. You know,
Mhm.
you're better off bulking that in. If you're gonna go ask for free cash, just adding that 150, because I think this is a very sports oriented town. A lot of people, their students play sports. I've talked to a lot of families in the last couple of weeks. Like, a lot of people are upset about the cuts to sports that was mentioned in the non-override list. There are lots of fears around that. So, the support that you would get from those families to support an override so that their sports aren't cut, you would lose all of that if you cut spring sports. So I think that should be taken off the table and look elsewhere. And
So, and I guess my pushback on that is like, I don't think anybody at this table is saying they want to cut spring sports, to be clear, like nobody.
Fair
I think,
disaster.
yeah, I think like that is not something anybody wants to do, and so I think we're all on the same page with that. I think what I feel like we have asked coming out of the finance committee of the district is give us a plan that gets us to zero so we can clearly communicate that and we can weigh exactly what you're saying. I know, like, what are the trade-offs here? And I continue to be frustrated that we didn't have that today, because I feel like we were clear about that a month ago when we were planning on getting this. And so I just want to Lizzie's point, I want to have the plan. Let's assume a scenario where the town says there's no free cash for you. Sorry, like, you're gonna have to figure it out within your own budget. What would that scenario be for us? What would the district say in that scenario where we're not able to get free cash? That how we close this gap. That's what I would want to see from y'all, to then be able to say, okay, that's too drastic. Like, let's go talk to the town about free cash, and to what extent are we talking about free cash?
Mhm.
Because every $50,000 matters. Again, we talked about like a $425,000 difference in the override was like something that was apparently completely off the table. So, so that is, I remain frustrated that we're still not at that place, and we're on March 12th. And again, I think we have some rough ideas here, but I'm not really sure, Lizzie, to your original point of like how we walk out of this meeting, what the direction is to the select board, to Amy, who's sitting here, around like how to proceed, other than to say we still have a $300,000 deficit, that like kind of best case scenario without cutting these other things. And is our proposal at this point, we're going to keep pushing the district to make a proposal for cutting that, but as it relates to the override number, the select board should assume reducing the $1 million allocation to the special ed reserve accounts by whatever percentage, any difference, I guess, within our current year operating reserve. We're saying that is the place we would recommend them cutting it. Is that where we're landing here?
Yeah, and I also just want to add, I know the MEA had sent us a letter to the elected boards, and also I think it was published on social media, but there was a date that they mentioned that when we knew about this deficit, the school committee knew was September 2024. And I know when we have publicly gone and spoken, we said we didn't know until the Q2 report in January. So again, I think we need to clarify that, because as Mark just mentioned, this is now we're March 12th and we still don't have a way of closing the gap. So this just does not reflect well on us. But at the same time, I think when we look at these, and what the ask is and how we go forward to select board and say, this is the only places we can close and we can't close here because, when we put these things on the table, we also have to know how will this message get out to the broader community? Because, you will lose support for things if depending on how you position it. So if the goal here is to pass the override, I think we have to be very mindful of what that message is.
And just to clarify, the school committee did not know about this in September. That needs to be clear.
That needs to be corrected then because it's out there.
I think Lizzie's correcting you now, but as
That's
you
what
know,
I'm
Anna, and
saying.
as we've talked about,
Yes.
it was quarter two report is the first time this was shared publicly.
Amy's got her.
Amy,
No, I'm not.
Okay.
Just a question on the circuit breaker, the 498 or whatever that number was.
480, yeah.
480, is that projected to have an impact on 26 as well? Do you think you'll get more in 26 as well that we haven't factored into anything?
No.
No, it's a one time.
it's that one-time correction for the
Mhm.
previous
Mhm.
shortfall.
Yeah, I think there's other factors with the circuit breaker reimbursement for next year that I'm concerned about. And that's why the numbers were reflected in the budget the way that they were.
Okay, I don't know if there's anything else to put a pin on this conversation. I unfortunately personally need a wrap. I assume other folks do too. Is there other information y'all need from us? Provide direction or next steps here for your work?
I mean, I think in terms of our work over the next day, I think it's returning and looking at the offset again. Figuring out kind of what the impacts would be to increase that and what the kind of the long range impact would be on fees and community schools. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is the HRS positions and what, if any, savings along with impact and the reason we didn't put that on the list is because we feel like the impact outweighs the benefit. And then the stipends and what, if any, kind of savings we can.
I think we just need to see transparently what has been
The
waived,
numbers, yeah.
even if it has been
Okay.
decided it's not worth it. Like, we need to understand what did you
Yeah.
consider?
Mhm.
So then we can understand why does that not make sense to do?
Right,
Mhm.
what,
Like, that is that's what we are missing.
Okay.
yeah.
Any? All right, so y'all work on that. I assume you also talk to Nick and Amy, whatever. John here who will walk out of here, but if you also want to give Richard a call, let him know.
Well, I get, yeah, so you're gonna work on this today, so you'll be able to share an update to us, the school committee, by tomorrow. Like, I do need a little more clarity on just like, what are we doing over the next?
When's the school committee
40.
meeting?
We
Until next
don't,
Wednesday.
What's that?
well,
We meet next Wednesday.
finance meets on Monday.
No, that's what I was
But that's
signaling
what
last night.
They were saying, what they were saying, we're waiting for the school committee meeting.
That's what I was saying. That's why I was shaking my head last night.
Okay.
We don't have a meeting tonight.
Okay, I thought
We had
there was a
this.
meeting tonight.
No,
So this is
have
it.
This meeting
This is it.
right now.
Yeah.
This
Yeah,
is it.
okay.
Yeah.
School committee meets,
First misunderstanding.
full school committee meets next
Yeah.
Wednesday night.
So I guess where you can sort of leave this, that we're at 283,000. as a gap. But looking very closely at other measures that do have great impact. Obviously, I mean, not that the ones we're taking right now do not have an impact, but it's further measures to close that even more. But we know that the cost to it might be too high, right? I mean, that's something that, I mean, that's just clearly, obviously, sports is one that none of us would want to do. But if, you know, there's like this, you must get to zero, unfortunately, right? And, but we may decide, no, we're gonna draw down because the cost is too much, right?
Mhm.
But that's a decision that we both have to make. But I think for the select board to know that that's where we are with the 283 at this point.
There's too much pain in getting below 280.
Right, it would
Well,
be,
maybe-
you know, it would be a huge pain. Yeah,
Pain isn't worth
our
it.
athletes in town, right? Like,
Mhm.
yes.
Mhm.
I wish they could be here and feel this
Yeah,
angst.
right, exactly.
I guess the part that I'm struggling with is the $1 million to the stabilization fund.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on that piece?
So I appreciate I think it's needed and I appreciate it. But when we're talking about cutting spring sports, as opposed to putting $1 million in the stabilization fund for future unanticipated costs. I mean, if we had a stabilization fund, we wouldn't even be having this conversation right now, right? Like we would have it to utilize it. So I don't want to discredit how much it's needed, but to have to cancel a spring sports season when I I can't express how important that is to some of our
Yeah,
kids.
no, for sure.
So
I think we're in agreement on it. I just,
Right,
That's
so, and I guess I'm just reiterating that, right, but to say, okay, we're not gonna do that for our kids because we want to put $1 million in a reserve fund that we didn't even essentially ask for.
So,
Yeah,
so
that's
in
what we
this
should then
case,
ask.
would you sort of say from, because I know that as you were talking about it and when we started talking about this,
And you're talking about the
special
special ed
education,
reserve,
special
right?
education.
When you say
When we-
stabilization.
Yeah, when we started talking about the special ed
$1 million.
education
That's like, we're-
fund, stabilization fund. The way sort of I understood you as we were talking about it is it would be a gradual build
Yes,
to that. So it wouldn't be in one time.
Right.
Here we are.
yes,
So that if we, you know, with this override, we got 700,000,
mhm,
that would be better than we've been, right?
Mhm.
And so drawing from that to close our remaining gap, it would not be a
Mhm.
terrible thing,
No.
because it would still put us in a better position and lessen the
Mhm.
impact to our students
correct.
this year. So
I
Yes,
also
Is it?
think we do
Okay.
need to. Because as I said before, we've been closing down the deficit, but then we've had increased costs. So we also have to be sure to definitively get to zero at the end of the year. I think. I agree that would be my recommendation in terms of the 300,000. I also think we do need to look at some of these things as well.
So I think we just need to get with the work you're gonna do today. We just need to get to the place of being clear in asking for that then,
Mhm.
because that's not up to us. It's the proposal that's been presented. We're requesting an adjustment to that proposal. And I think there's a rationale, like you just said.
Mhm.
So I think it's just about being able to clearly explain, this is what we're asking to be adjusted within option B. This is why. And then we're moving forward. I mean, right?
And I think the list of what you consider is extremely important to provide to the select board
Mhm.
so that they know that you have
Right.
considered these hard decisions. And my gut is a lot of people will agree with that. right? But if you have the list, you have the support to say, look, we've really talked about it, and so the public knows what.
Here's what we were
what was
considering.
100%,
on the Table.
That's what
and
we've been saying. Yep.
That you do get that support, and it doesn't hurt the support for the override.
Right.
At least we
Exactly.
talked about it,
Right.
we considered it.
And to your Katie's point, that the override, the offset, whatever we're calling it, the $1 million is needed more now than in later. Is that what I heard?
Yep.
Basically,
Yes,
26 budget is
million.
much better.
300,000.
Huh?
Not the
Not
full
much
amount, but
in,
yes.
the funding,
No,
but
but the fund is being put aside $1 million.
Yes.
I'm not saying we need $1 million, I'm
Okay.
saying what's
Good.
been.
A part of
Right,
that,
right.
Mhm.
a part of that has a much better impact now.
yeah,
How do we get it from then to now is the.
Of course, yeah. It's just free cash allocation.
It's
So
free
we're
cash.
using it in the current year versus,
And my
Next
understanding
year.
too is there's also 700,000 as a.
Well, that was in option B, that was reduced.
Or something.
so that was a reduction to our operating budget
Yeah.
though, correct?
Correct.
In option B, yeah.
So that's what they can give.
It's a reduction to the operating
To the
budget,
operating.
Right, but it's,
Of-
it's being
or-
held in reserve, but so you're gonna give it back.
but reserve is one-time money and the operating budget is reoccurring. And so it's not. It's,
It's.
the $1 million is one time, the operating budget is,
I think we're getting a little bit into like the
Yeah,
FY 26, like the stuff that was talked about last night, which we need to get into, but just from effort of 9:30. I think that is stuff we will talk about on Monday. I think Amy and Joanna both agreed to come on Monday to talk about that, so we can talk again. I think that's a piece we want to dive in specifically on the impact of the select board's decision last night. Obviously, that could change on Friday based upon kind of the conversation today. And so having that discussion on Monday will be important. And we have meeting next Monday and next Tuesday. Next Monday and next Wednesday are our next two finance meetings. Is there anything else pressing as we walk out this door that like y'all, again, we need to nail down? Okay. Then I will appreciate the work. I'll move us forward. Do we want to vote on meeting minutes? Okay, are you okay with that? All right, then I will make a motion. I'm gonna defer the 7th because I did not finish the 7th meeting minutes, but we have the 10th, the 26th, the 3rd, and the 5th. I'll make a motion to approve those.
Second.
All in favor? Great, thank you. And then next meeting dates, as I said, we have one next Monday and Tuesday. I'm sorry, next Monday and Wednesday. We have another one the following Monday and Wednesday. So we are continuing to do our Monday, Wednesday meetings the next through the end of March at least. Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor? We're adjourned.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna.
Anna.